Have you ever woken up to find that your entire cabin has been wrapped in barbed wire? The kind that makes it look like a military prison? Yeah, that was me last Saturday morning. To top it off, there was a laminated note zip-tied to the fence reading, "This property now falls under HOA jurisdiction. Unauthorized entry will be prosecuted." It was signed with a heart next to a name I didn't recognize. I wasn't sure if I should laugh, cry, or scream, but one thing was for sure, Karen had just tangled with the wrong family. See, the cabin she was trying to fence off belonged to my dad, and my dad. He just happens to be the chief of staff to the governor of this state. The cabin had been in our family for decades, tucked deep in the woods where GPS signals go to die, where nature is quiet and peaceful. It was sacred to us. It's where I learned how to hunt, how to fish, and how to chop wood without cutting off a toe. It was our sanctuary, until the HOA decided it was ripe for the taking. It all started a few months ago when new, luxury homes began popping up a mile down the mountain. This was part of a development called Pinebrook Hills. And with it came the dreaded HOA, led by none other than Karen, who I would soon learn was a total nightmare. I was up at the cabin that weekend to check on things, make sure the generator was working, see if raccoons had turned the attic into a nightclub. That's when I saw her, a woman in a visor and khakis, driving a pastel green golf cart like it was her patrol vehicle. She had that look, the one that said, "Everything I roll over belongs to me by divine right." She didn't introduce herself with a name, just asked, "You the one squatting here?" I blinked. "This is private property," I replied, "it's been in my family for 30 years. She didn't flinch. Instead, she whipped out a rolled-up map, almost like a magician about to perform a trick. "This area," she said smugly, "is part of the new HOA jurisdictional realignment." She said it like it was a divine truth. I didn't even know what that meant, but I could guess. She introduced herself as President Winder, though I later learned her real name was Karen. Of course it was. She proceeded to tell me I was violating HOA codes, things like camping on undeveloped land, improper waste disposal, unauthorized structure maintenance. I laughed, not just because it was ridiculous, but because we weren't part of any HOA. The nearest paved road was a 5-minute drive away, and the cabin had been legally grandfathered in long before Pinebrook Hills was even a thought. But Karen was on a power trip with no brakes. "I'll be following up," she chirped, turning her golf cart around and vanishing down the trail as if she had just conducted a military raid. I figured it was a one-time, weird encounter. Maybe she'd come back with cookies or an apology note. But no. The next morning, I woke up to a freaking fortress of barbed wire. Not just along the driveway, but wrapped entirely around the property, complete with warning signs that read, "Private HOA land. Trespassers will be fined." To make matters worse, I found my dad's pickup truck, which I had parked just off the trail, booted. No notices. No hearings. Just razor-sharp steel and enough passive-aggressive signage to make Stalin blush. I took plenty of pictures and sent them to my dad with the message, "The cabin's been seized by a suburban warlord. Also, she drives a mint green golf cart." 5 minutes later, my dad called. Not in a panic, but in that calm, low voice he uses when he's about to make someone's life very difficult. "Did she leave her name?" he asked. "Karen Winder," I replied. "She says she's the HOA president now." There was a long pause on the line before he said, "Oh boy. She picked the wrong week." Dad isn't the type to flaunt his position, he actually avoids it. Most people know the governor's name, but not his staff. That's how he likes it, no limelight, just results. But when someone messes with something he cares about, like the last peaceful place he owns, he knows how to make calls that shake things up. Karen had no idea that the guy who taught me how to clean a rifle was also the guy who reviewed state infrastructure budgets, vetoed unethical bills, and had state troopers on speed dial. Still, I wasn't about to just sit back and wait for the cavalry. I needed to see what kind of lunatic thought they could annex land like this. So, I headed into Pinebrook Hills to investigate. That's when I got a closer look at what Karen called her HOA headquarters. It was her oversized mansion, retrofitted with a gazebo, an unnecessarily tall flagpole, and a Ring doorbell that likely sent facial recognition alerts straight to her phone. I saw her again out front, giving orders to a guy who looked like a retired security guard with too much energy. His name was Dale, and he wore a utility belt, though it was empty. Karen spotted me and immediately launched into a lecture about respecting HOA regulations, even though I hadn't stepped foot on her lawn. She pointed to a binder, yes, an actual binder, labeled Cabin Offenders, Class B Encroachments. She had made a file on us. I asked if she had filed anything legally. She laughed, saying, "This is legal. The community agrees." And that's when I realized, she genuinely thought she could strong-arm an entire family off their land because she had a fancy title and a map she printed off Google. Back at the cabin, I stood by the new fence, staring at it like it was some surreal art installation. Barbed wire on our land. I pulled out my phone, zoomed in on the sign that read, HOA Controlled Zone, Stay Out, and snapped a picture. I smiled because what Karen didn't know, couldn't have known, was that behind every HOA nightmare, there's a reckoning waiting in the wings. And hers was about to be delivered by the governor's right-hand man. Let the games begin. Karen Winder didn't run a homeowners association. She ran a regime. Pinebrook Hills looked peaceful from the outside, with its imported palm trees, cookie-cutter mansions, and artisanal dog parks. But beneath the surface, it was a dictatorship, held together by passive-aggressive newsletters, lawn ornament ordinances, and HOA fines so frequent they might as well have been subscriptions. I wasn't surprised to learn that Karen held weekly, emergency meetings. What shocked me was the turnout. Dozens of residents showed up, sipping cucumber water and clutching notepads as if they were entering a classified briefing. Karen stood at the center like a cult leader in a tennis skirt, microphone clipped to her collar, standing on a platform she insisted on calling the accountability stage. I sat in the back, sunglasses on, trying not to laugh as Karen held up a giant laminated map of Pinebrook Hills, drawing a cartoonish arrow pointing to our family cabin and labeling it, Illegally Occupied Zone. Next to it, in bold, red ink, the word, squatter. I wish I were kidding. She went on to talk about threats to community aesthetics, non-compliant structures, and how our cabin was harboring wildlife that may not have been HOA approved. It was a cabin in the woods, not Jurassic Park. Dale, her overzealous sidekick, stood nearby, nodding like a bobblehead, occasionally adding a preach or amen. Karen ended her presentation with a dramatic sigh, declaring, "We cannot let this outsider endanger our property values or our peace. This is our community, and we have rules for a reason." The crowd erupted into applause. Actual applause. Someone even whistled. It was like a TED Talk for tyrants. I raised my hand. Karen narrowed her eyes and reluctantly pointed at me. I stood up, cleared my throat, and said, "So just to clarify, you're calling a legally owned, fully deeded, state-owned family cabin a threat to your neighborhood because it doesn't match your paint palette?" There was a beat of silence, followed by a few chuckles from the back rows. Karen's eyes flared. Dale took a step forward, ready to arrest me with his empty utility belt. Karen cut me off. "This is not a debate forum," she said, teeth clenched. "If you'd like to make an appeal, there's a formal process. You'll need to fill out Form 37B, submit 2 copies of your land deed, proof of address, and undergo a visual inspection to determine if your structure meets our aesthetic standards." I could feel my blood pressure rising, but then I remembered something my dad always said: never argue with someone who decorates their mailbox seasonally. It's not worth the breath. So, instead of shouting, I smiled. The next move wasn't mine. It was Dad's. When I got back to the cabin, I found him already waiting on the porch, sipping coffee like a man with a loaded deck. "So," he said, glancing at the barbed wire, "this is the HOA's idea of hospitality?" I nodded. Karen held a whole rally, called me a squatter, and suggested we were attracting rogue squirrels. Dad chuckled, then, in that calm, calculating tone he used in meetings with state officials, he said, "Let's begin." Over the next hour, Dad made a series of quiet calls to zoning offices, legal advisors, and a state liaison who laughed for a full minute after hearing the words, barbed wire, and HOA jurisdiction. By sundown, the wheels of a much larger machine had started to turn. But Karen wasn't done. 2 days later, I returned to find the cabin's power completely cut. The generator lines had been slashed. A notice was pinned to the front door claiming unauthorized utilities usage. Apparently, Karen had convinced someone on the HOA board that our connection to the state transformer down the hill was an unauthorized siphoning operation. Now, we weren't just squatters, we were power thieves. Dale was seen patrolling the trail with a clipboard and walkie-talkie, muttering phrases like, "perimeter secure," and "target hasn't moved." It was like living next to a wannabe spy who watched too many Jason Bourne movies. Dad didn't get angry. He got focused. He took photos of everything, the fencing, the notices, the power lines. He compiled it all into a neat folder labeled HOA Overreach, Exhibit A. Meanwhile, Karen began distributing newsletters titled Defending Our Borders, making the situation sound like a national emergency. She described us as outsiders with unknown intentions, and warned residents to report any sightings of non-community individuals near the restricted zone. I wasn't sure if we were being painted as squatters or international fugitives, but one thing was clear, Karen was unhinged. To counter her narrative, I started posting updates online. There's something strangely satisfying about documenting a ridiculous situation when you know the world's going to see it. I didn't go for anything aggressive, just facts, photos, and a bit of commentary. People ate it up. Especially the clip of Dale, the HOA enforcer, tripping and falling into a pile of his own barbed wire while trying to reinstall the fence. That video alone hit 2.3 million views in 3 days. The internet dubbed him HOA Rambo, and the memes came fast. My favorite was a screenshot of him tripping over a loose rock, with the caption, "When you try to defend HOA property but forget physics." Even local reporters started to catch wind of the bizarre suburban war unfolding in the woods. Karen tried to fight back against the narrative. She issued a formal demand for the meme pages to take the content down, but that only made it worse. One YouTuber turned her newsletter into a dramatic reading, complete with background violins, calling it Karen versus the cabin. It went viral almost instantly. Karen blamed us, of course, claiming we were manipulating public perception, but we didn't need to manipulate anything. We simply showed the truth, and Karen did the rest by being herself. Back at the cabin, we played it cool. Dad knew a takedown was coming, he was just waiting for the right moment to make the impact hit hardest. Every phone call, every document he gathered was part of a much bigger plan. But even as the legal wheels started to turn, Karen's tactics became more absurd by the day. She installed motion-activated lights aimed at the woods to detect incursions. She even posted a "no filming" sign at the Pinebrook gate, as if she could control the internet. Then she ramped up her patrols, hiring a local teenager to bike around and report any unusual activity. The poor kid just filmed squirrels eating Cheetos. But behind all the humor, there was a deeper, unsettling feeling. Watching someone try to erase your family's legacy out of sheer entitlement was disturbing. That cabin wasn't just wood and nails, it was memory. It was the smell of pine needles and bacon. It was where I learned to whistle with my fingers from my dad. And now it was wrapped in wire and targeted by a woman who thought leadership came with laminated maps and a megaphone. Here's the thing about power trips, they always crash. Karen didn't realize that every move she made was being documented. Every decision she made, every patrol, every absurd claim was being quietly prepared for a reckoning. She thought she was untouchable, but she was walking right into a trap that my dad had set up for her. While she was busy playing HOA dictator, My dad was building a case that would make her entire operation implode. When it did, it wouldn't involve barbed wire or golf carts, it would be headlines, courtrooms, and a state-level correction she never saw coming. Nighttime at the cabin had always been peaceful, crickets chirping, the breeze rustling through the trees, the occasional sound of a deer brushing through the undergrowth. But now, thanks to Karen's barbed wire campaign, it felt like we were behind enemy lines. Even the moonlight seemed suspicious, like it was scanning for movement. I parked my truck a little ways down the ridge, out of sight, and hiked up the trail with a backpack full of bolt cutters, a GoPro, and a sandwich. I wasn't about to cut through barbed wire on an empty stomach. Dad had already been up there for an hour, moving with the calm precision of someone who had overseen disaster response plans for a living. He'd set up trail cameras along the perimeter, camouflaged, motion-activated, and night vision enabled. He wasn't just cutting wire, he was gathering evidence. The plan wasn't to vandalize, it was to document. We needed to prove the intrusion, show how far Karen had gone. If we just slashed and dashed, it would be our word against hers. But with video timestamps and a little patience, we could build a digital trap, a trap Karen would walk into all on her own. The bolt cutters bit through the wire with a satisfying snap. We didn't take down the entire fence, just a 10-foot section near the rear of the cabin. Enough to allow access and expose the absurdity of the barricade. Dad placed a laminated sign on a wooden post beside the breach that read, "Private property, State Zone Trail, monitored for legal documentation." Simple, direct, and designed to give the HOA busybodies something to chew on. We installed reflective markers along the trail and added a second camera hidden inside a hollowed-out birdhouse. It wasn't exactly Mission Impossible, but it sure felt like it. The real fun came the next morning. Right on cue, Dale showed up, his golf cart now equipped with flashing amber lights, probably scavenged from an old landscaping rig, and a loudspeaker that crackled with feedback every time he tried to speak. He stepped out with the swagger of someone who'd been told he was important by someone equally delusional. Aviator sunglasses, utility vest, combat boots, the guy looked like a security guard cosplaying as a Navy SEAL. The trail camera caught everything, Dale walking up to the cut section, tripping over a loose rock, and falling face-first into the remaining wire. There was a yell, a scramble, a whole lot of cursing, and then the sound of his walkie-talkie sputtering as he tried to call for backup. I posted the footage to Reddit under a thread titled "HOA Enforcer Gets a Taste of His Own Fence." Within hours, it hit the front page. Someone added dramatic music, another edited it into a full movie trailer. Dale was now internet famous for all the wrong reasons. Karen was livid. She issued a statement in the next HOA newsletter, calling the video manipulated, slanderous, and even, potentially treasonous to community harmony. Treasonous, as if our cabin had declared war on Pinebrook Hills. But the more she tried to control the narrative, the worse it got. She ordered Dale to reinstall the fencing, but this time with added warning lights and a mini solar panel to power the motion detectors. The only problem? The power came from a transformer that wasn't hers to use. It was part of a state renewable energy grid that my dad had helped launch 3 years ago, the same grid Karen was now illegally tapping into. We filed a formal report with the County Utilities Board, attaching GPS-tagged footage of Dale awkwardly rigging up the wires with duct tape and zip ties. It was amateur hour, and the audience was growing. Local media started circling. A small-town paper ran a piece titled "Cabin vs. Karen, the HOA Battle in the Pines." The article painted us as calm, reasonable landowners, and Karen as a power-hungry tyrant who treated easements like international borders. One woman even shared a story about how Karen fined her $200 for planting daisies that didn't match the neighborhood's approved color palette. Another person recalled how Karen tried to ban wind chimes for violating noise regulations. The image of Karen as a well-meaning community leader was unraveling fast. Still, Karen doubled down. She had Dale stake out the trail overnight, hoping to catch us doing something, anything, illegal. The poor guy looked exhausted. One morning we found him sleeping upright in his golf cart, clutching his clipboard like it was a teddy bear. Another time, he tried to chase a squirrel that had triggered the motion detectors and ended up losing his shoe in the mud. Of course, it was all on camera too. I uploaded that one with the caption Dale vs. Nature, round 2. But even as the internet laughed, things were getting serious. Dad had looped in a senior legal advisor from the governor's office. She didn't just see the overreach, she saw potential violations of zoning laws, misuse of public infrastructure, and false claims of jurisdiction. She recommended filing a formal injunction against the HOA and freezing all enforcement actions related to our property. Paperwork was filed, case numbers were assigned. Karen, blissfully unaware, was still hosting meetings, talking about expanding the HOA's reach to nearby undeveloped parcels, bragging that Pinebrook was setting a gold standard for community order. She had no idea she was standing on a legal landmine. To make things even more interesting, a local environmental watchdog group got involved. The barbed wire Karen installed was interfering with local deer migration paths, violating at least 2 state wildlife statutes. A representative from the group, wearing a Deer Division t-shirt, showed up one afternoon, snapping photos of the wire. Dale tried to chase him off, but ended up getting himself filmed making threats with a rolled-up newsletter. That clip went viral too, titled When HOA Enforcers Meet Environmentalists. It was a hit with both Reddit and Facebook boomers. By the end of the week, Karen's carefully constructed empire of rules, fines, and fences had turned into a circus, and she was the main attraction. But what she still didn't know, what made Dad smile like a man playing chess with half the pieces hidden, was that the governor himself had been briefed. Not just out of courtesy, but because Karen hadn't just barbed a fence, she had obstructed access to land that was part of a conservation pilot program funded and protected at the state level. The cabin wasn't just private property, it was tied to state legislation Karen had never even heard of. And she was about to find out. The tension built like a violin string being pulled tight. Karen was too drunk on her own authority to realize that every move she made was stacking the odds against her. When it finally snapped, it wouldn't just be her reputation on the line, it would be the entire HOA structure she used to prop herself up. We just had to wait, record, and let her hang herself with the very wire she had wrapped around us. Karen Winder's downfall didn't come with a bang. It started with a phone call. A perfectly calm, polite voice left a message on her voicemail, saying, "This is a courtesy notice from the office of the governor regarding a potential zoning conflict. Please return our call within 48 hours. Most people would hear that and feel a chill. But Karen wasn't most people. She scoffed, hit delete, and muttered something about pranksters. She didn't return the call. She didn't even Google the number. Her ego was so inflated, she believed her imaginary authority outweighed the actual state government. That's when things got real. A week later, Karen was hosting her monthly HOA brunch on her meticulously pressure-washed patio, muffins and mimosas laid out like a community gathering straight out of a Pinterest board. The residents of Pinebrook Hills mingled under string lights while Karen stood in front of her handcrafted, Community First, banner, about to give her speech about aesthetic unity and perimeter vigilance. Then a black SUV pulled up to the curb. Out stepped a uniformed state trooper, clipboard in hand. Karen paused mid-toast. Everyone turned to watch as the trooper calmly walked up, confirmed her name, and handed her a bright yellow envelope marked with the seal of the governor's office. It was a cease and desist letter. A very public one. Karen tried to play it cool, laughing off the situation with a wave of her hand. "Oh, just some bureaucratic nonsense," she chirped, though the slight tremor in her hand betrayed her. She tucked the envelope under her arm as she returned to her brunch, but it was clear the damage was done. Word spread quickly, and within hours, the Pinebrook group chat, yes, it existed, was buzzing with messages. Screenshots of the letter started circulating online, with phrases like state violation, unauthorized jurisdiction, and imminent legal action causing panic. People began canceling landscaping appointments and backing out of HOA meetings. In response, Karen sent out a community-wide email, calling the state's involvement a gross misunderstanding. She claimed the governor's office had been manipulated by outsider influence, and that outsider, of course, was us. But her explanation didn't hold up for long. The next morning, the local news picked up the story. Channel 9 aired a segment titled Cabin Clash, HOA versus State Official, featuring side-by-side footage of Karen's barbed wire fence and an interview with Dad. They blurred his face and used the caption "Senior State Staffer," but it didn't take a genius to figure out who he was. The man Karen had been accusing of squatting and violating codes was now revealed as the second most powerful person in the state's government. The story quickly shifted from a petty neighborhood dispute to a tale of a small-town dictator targeting a public official out of personal ego, while crossing legal lines in the process. Karen tried to spin things further. She held a press conference in front of the Pinebrook sign, flanked by a weary Dale and two board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. She claimed she was defending her community from encroachment, that she was standing up for property rights, and that she had no idea who the cabin belonged to, insisting she was just following protocol. Unfortunately for her, the footage told a different story. The videos we posted, showing Dale tripping into barbed wire, the illegal power tampering, and the motion sensor debacle, all aired on national television. Commentary flooded in. Late-night shows made jokes, with one even running a skit where an actress played Karen surrounded by fences, shouting, "I am the HOA." It couldn't have been more deliciously ironic. But the real kicker was how Dad stayed completely silent through it all. No dramatic interviews. No press releases. Just quiet, coordinated action behind the scenes. Then the governor himself broke the silence with a short statement: "We support our staff and expect community leaders to uphold the law, not circumvent it." It was subtle, but devastating. A clear signal to every city council, county office, and zoning board in the state that Karen had crossed a line much bigger than she realized. Next came the audit. One morning, a quiet man in khakis and glasses walked into the Pinebrook HOA office with a briefcase and a badge. He was from the State Housing Oversight Committee, and he wasn't there to shake hands. Karen, ever the hostess, tried to offer coffee and give a tour of the office, which was really just her sunroom. But the man had one question: where are the HOA funds being allocated? What followed was a spiral of awkward explanations, deflections, and a frantic search for receipts. It turned out Karen had been using community funds to install a wine fridge in her home office, repave her personal driveway with imported pavers, and commission a $3,000 hummingbird sculpture for her backyard because, according to her, it represented neighborhood harmony. The news of the audit hit Pinebrook like a lightning bolt. Those who had once cheered for Karen now began demanding answers. Emergency meetings were called, angry emails flew, and Dale resigned via a sticky note on the HOA office door that simply read, "I'm out." The board, once unified in their support of Karen, descended into infighting. Some tried to distance themselves, while others scrambled to cover their tracks. Karen insisted it was all a witch hunt, but the illusion of her power was quickly disintegrating. She wasn't a leader, she was a liability. Meanwhile, Dad and I returned to the cabin, stepping over the now wilted fence and watching a few deer grazing near the edge of the property. The cameras had done their job. The documents were filed. The case had officially shifted from a backyard dispute to formal litigation. But more importantly, the entire community had witnessed Karen's true nature. She wasn't just a micromanaging control freak. She was someone who was willing to weaponize authority for personal gain. A week later, we received a letter from the state zoning board, stamped with gold and signed by officials. It confirmed what we already knew: the land our cabin stood on was exempt from any HOA jurisdiction. Not only that, but Karen's actions had interfered with a designated state-managed property. The wording was clear, final, and beautifully formal. We printed it, framed it, and hung it above the cabin's fireplace. Karen, on the other hand, found herself increasingly isolated. Neighbors began ignoring her. The HOA board voted to suspend all her presidential privileges, including budget control and access to the Pinebrook Facebook page. Rumor had it she tried to form a mini HOA within her own block, but the residents shut it down with a unanimous vote. You could feel her influence draining from her porch, like air leaking from a tire. Still, Dad never gloated. He just returned to his favorite chair on the porch, coffee in hand, boots crossed, watching the trees sway in the breeze. When I asked him how he stayed so calm, he simply said, "You don't need to fight fire with fire. Just let them keep striking matches in a room full of gasoline." Karen had done exactly that, and now her entire empire of fences and fines was going up in flames, metaphorically, of course. The wire would eventually come down, the signs would vanish, and our cabin, the one that started it all, would remain exactly where it belonged. Karen's final move arrived wrapped in legal jargon and desperation. It came in a manila envelope delivered by a courier who looked as embarrassed to hand it over as we were to receive it. Inside was a restraining order request and a formal lawsuit for damages to HOA property. She claimed emotional distress, intentional sabotage, and vandalism of community safety structures, referring, of course, to the barbed wire she had illegally installed on our land. The fact that she had wrapped our cabin like a maximum security prison and was now suing us for cutting a small section of it was almost impressive in its audacity. Almost. Dad read through the papers calmly, barely flinching. I, on the other hand, laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. "She's suing us for removing her criminal evidence," I said, blinking at the absurdity of it. Dad gave a tired smile and said, "Let her. It'll be the final nail." What Karen didn't realize, though, was that filing a lawsuit opened the door to discovery, meaning every receipt, email, and HOA transaction would be scrutinized under the court's microscope. What she thought was an attack on us was actually the key to exposing everything she tried to hide. Court day arrived, and it felt more like a finale than a hearing. The courthouse was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and most cases were about parking tickets or fence line disputes. But this one drew a crowd. Reporters stood outside with cameras ready, and locals filled the benches, excited as if it were a sports event. Even Dale showed up, sitting quietly in the back row, wearing a plain shirt and looking about 10 pounds lighter in ego. Karen strutted in wearing a blazer 2 sizes too tight and a neck brace that had definitely not been there before. When questioned about it, she claimed the stress of the situation had given her spinal tension. Her lawyer, a flustered man who clearly hadn't prepared, fumbled through introductions. Meanwhile, Dad walked in, wearing his usual button-up and boots, holding nothing but a leather folder and the quiet confidence of a man with every receipt ready and every witness on standby. The judge, an older woman with a dry wit and zero tolerance for nonsense, turned to Karen's lawyer and asked him to begin. He launched into a speech about reckless disregard for community order and unlawful property damage. He even submitted printed copies of the memes that had gone viral, claiming they contributed to Karen's emotional distress. One of the memes, featuring Karen photoshopped onto a Game of Thrones Iron Throne made entirely of HOA violation letters, was presented as Exhibit B. The judge glanced at it, blinked once, and then turned to Karen. "Did you really install barbed wire on someone else's private property without legal authorization?" she asked. Karen huffed and said it was part of a community enforcement initiative. The judge raised an eyebrow. "So, no." When it was our turn, Dad stood and calmly presented the original deed, the zoning map, and the utility inspection report confirming the power line tampering. He played the trail cam footage of Dale installing motion sensors and cutting into the transformer panel. He handed over emails from Pinebrook residents who'd submitted complaints about Karen's spending and overreach, and finally, he submitted a copy of the governor's cease and desist order and a formal statement from the Office of State Lands confirming our property's immunity from HOA jurisdiction. The courtroom fell silent. Karen's lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The judge tapped her pen on the desk, looked at Karen, and said, "This isn't just frivolous, it's backwards. You're the one who committed multiple violations. The fact that you tried to spin this into a lawsuit is almost impressive, if it weren't so absurd. She dismissed the case on the spot and fined Karen for court costs, misuse of HOA funds for legal action, and trespassing. The total? Just over $118,000. Karen turned bright red and tried to object, but the judge waved her hand dismissively, as if swatting a fly. The hearing was over. The war was officially won. A week later, Pinebrook Hills held a community vote. Karen was formally removed as HOA president in a landslide decision. The board was restructured, audits began, and several members who had blindly followed her quietly resigned. Karen's house went on the market days after the vote. The listing described it as charming, executive style, and freshly landscaped, but everyone in town knew the truth. It was a retreat. Dale surprisingly resurfaced a few days later. He came to the cabin, hat in hand, eyes down, no clipboard. He apologized, said he got caught up in the whole thing, and didn't realize how far Karen had taken it until it was too late. Dad shook his hand, nodded, and said, "We all get pulled into things sometimes. Just don't forget where the line is." Dale nodded and glanced at the trail cam we'd left up. "You going to leave that thing running?" he asked. I shrugged. "Let's just say it's good for neighborhood safety." And with that, everything returned to peace at the cabin. The air was finally still again, peaceful. The barbed wire had been removed, the power lines restored, and the deer had returned to their usual paths. One afternoon, Dad and I sat on the porch, sipping iced tea, watching as the sun dipped below the ridge. He glanced at the sign we had placed near the trailhead, a carved wooden plaque with hand-stained lettering, "Cabin of the Chief. State-protected property." It was a subtle, quiet reminder to anyone who might think about testing us again. The online buzz had long since faded, replaced by the next viral absurdity, but in Pinebrook Hills, the story lingered. A new HOA president had stepped in, one who promised transparency, community input, and, most importantly, a strict no-barbed wire policy. As for Karen, she was spotted one last time at a gas station outside of town. Still wearing that ridiculous visor, she muttered to herself about government overreach, her pastel green golf cart now hitched to a trailer behind a dented SUV. She drove off, disappearing down the highway. As for us, we didn't seek revenge. We didn't throw a victory party or put up banners celebrating her downfall. We didn't need to. We simply reclaimed what was always ours, with dignity, patience, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing we didn't have to fight dirty to win. Karen thought she could force us out, using rules and threats, but what she never realized was that the law, the truth, and a few strategically placed cameras were all we truly needed. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone thinks about using barbed wire to encircle someone else's life, they'll remember what happened up here in the pines, and think twice.